When I was a high school senior, what I wanted about as much as anything in this world was to qualify for the state high school cross-country championship. I wanted it so badly that I literally ran myself into the hospital, became severely dehydrated. I went into seizures. My parents took me into the doctor, and I'll never forget how he dismissed them. He asked them to leave the room, and then he looked at me and said, "Gary, I just need to know, are you on anything? Have you taken anything?" And dismissing my parents was his way of saying, this isn't about you getting in trouble. It's not about you doing anything wrong. I just need to know, if I want to be a participant in your healing, what's really going on in your life. I thought about this memory when I was in seminary and was reading the words of John Calvin, who talked about how after we become believers, God no longer looks at us like a prosecuting attorney. He looks at us like a physician. It's not about sending us to jail or punishing us or finding us guilty. It's about helping us to become whole. In the same way, if we want to cherish our spouse who stumbles in many ways, we have to have the attitude of a physician, not a prosecuting attorney. We have to let our spouse know that we cherish them for who they are and we want them to become well and to become whole, not to punish them. The way that we handle a spouse who stumbles in many ways will determine whether or not we have a marriage where our partner feels truly cherished. Most people think that a great marriage is based on great compatibility. But the reality is my wife and I believe, have a great marriage, and we're not very compatible. We're so different in so many ways. If I find a restaurant I really like, I want to go there all the time. Lisa always wants to go someplace new. Just the other week, I had an appointment on a Saturday at noon to meet a young man for lunch, and we're going to go to Velvet Taco, one of my favorite places in Houston. And so when I was picking up a meal the afternoon before, I went to Velvet Taco. My wife couldn't believe it. She goes, "Aren't you meeting Jay there tomorrow?" I said, "Yeah." She goes, "So why would you go there today?" I didn't even understand the premise of the question. I thought, because I like Velvet Taco. If I found a place I like, why don't I want to go there 2 days in a row? Lisa and I don't just have different attitudes about restaurants. We have different attitudes about music. I'm a huge fan of 70s music. In fact, on most Saturdays, I'm listening to the old Casey Kasem programs on satellite radio where they go through the top 40 list from that week. Lisa is decidedly not a 70s fan. In fact, this is how much she isn't a 70s fan. When a very famous person died not that long ago, Lisa came downstairs the next morning and said, "Now, who was it that died? Was it Prince or was it Queen? I keep getting the two mixed up." In fact, it's not compatibility that determines whether you're going to have a great marriage or not. It's often how we handle each other's sin. James chapter 3, verse 2 says this, "We all stumble in many ways." It's a verse I used in Sacred Marriage. It's a verse I used in my book, A Lifelong Love, because I believe it's sin that often tears down our marriages. And so if we're going to build marriages where we cherish each other's, we're going to have to learn how to treat each other's sin like a physician, not as a prosecuting attorney. I remember there's one time in my life, though I have such an excellent wife whose excellence far exceeds mine, but I was having to deal with one of her issues because she's not a perfect wife. There's no perfect wife out there. And as I was feeling a little bit sorry for myself, showing my stupidity, I felt the Lord's voice cut in and said, "Gary, this is how your wife stumbles." I've used James chapter 3, verse 2 in so many conferences, and yet here I was frustrated that I'm not married to a completely perfect wife. It's like so many of us expect to wake up married to the fourth member of the Trinity, but nobody gets to do that because there is no fourth member of the Trinity. But here's what we learn from Scripture. Both Paul and Jesus had extraordinary compassion for sinners, even though their holiness far exceeds ours. Jesus was sinless. Paul says in terms of human righteousness that he could be called faultless, and yet both displayed an unbelievable empathy and compassion for the fallings and the sins of others. And when I read through the Christian classics, one theme kept presenting itself over and over again, that our level of experiential holiness is directly related to our compassion towards sinners. And Scripture backs that up. Look at Ephesians 4, 1 through 3. It says this, "Live a life worthy of the calling you have received." Now, what does it mean to live a life worthy of the calling we've received? Listen to these words carefully. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient. bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Or consider Colossians, a very similar passage. As God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. These two verses, key scriptures on what it means to be holy, shows us that holiness is all about putting up with others' messes. Notice it talks about being gentle, patient, bearing with one another, forgiving one another. Those assume that we're dealing with others who have hurt us or sinned against us. So holiness is almost exclusively tied to how we treat others who are messing up or in need. Doesn't that completely change the way of how we think a holy person is supposed to be? In biblical terms, a holy person isn't known by what he or she watches or doesn't watch, by what words they choose to use, or how often they're in a church service. It's by how he or she treats fellow sinners. Our experiential holiness is defined in large part by our ability to gracefully bear the lack of holiness in others. Now, for a cherishing marriage, this begins with our spouse. And it helps understand that most, not all, but most sin is conceived in hurt. That's not to excuse the sin that we see in our spouse, but to understand the motivation behind the sin. If we want to be a physician, not a prosecuting attorney, we have to understand that it's not about punishing our spouse or catching our spouse, but being one of God's representatives, one of God's servants to help them heal. That we're going to be a physician, not a prosecuting attorney. So let's look at some of the ways that we can have this attitude when we understand how exactly our spouse stumbles. The first thing to remember when cherishing a spouse who stumbles in many ways is to remind yourself that every spouse has certain bothersome tendencies that won't change. If you can only cherish a perfect spouse, you'll never have a cherishing marriage because there's no perfect spouse out there. In fact, I feel like a big part of my premarital counseling is to help prospective spouses understand what's permanent and what's not going to change. My wife and I used to live out in the far suburbs of Houston before we moved closer in. And the traffic got worse by the month. The builders were developing so many homes and traffic kept getting worse and worse and worse. When we first moved there, I had to be on the road by 6 a.m. where I'd face a lot of traffic, and then 5:45. And by about the last little bit before we moved, I had to be on the road by about 5:20 or I'm going to be sitting in a lot of traffic. And one morning I slept in a little bit too much. It was already well past 5:30 and I'm trying to get out the door and I just can't find my keys. I'm looking everywhere trying to find my keys. I've got my cell phone flashlight on. My wife is still in bed. Finally, that kind of wakes her up and she goes, "What's the matter?" I said, "I can't find my car keys." She goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I had to take your car last night. I couldn't find my car keys." And so she got out of bed, and now we're trying to find her car keys. She'd put them in her purse, but she's not a morning person. It takes a while for her brain to engage, so we're having to search for her purse. Finally, we find her purse where my keys are in. She hands them to her. She goes, "Gary, I'm so sorry." And there would have been an earlier part of my marriage when I would have had to let her know just how she had put me out. But the reality is, Lisa knew what this meant. She knew that traffic backed up. She knew what it meant for my morning. And I could see that she felt terrible. And so I just tenderly looked at her and said, "I know you didn't mean to do that. It's okay." To have a cherishing marriage, you've got to find those character qualities in your spouse that you know will probably always be there. And in one sense, just let them go. There was nothing to be gained by letting Lisa know how frustrated I was. She already knew. There was no point in venting. In fact, I believe that if I would have just vented and laid out, then I would have felt terrible, would have been praying about it. Instead, just accepting that, "Gary, just stop off at a Starbucks. Get yourself a cup of tea. Know you're going to be sitting in traffic." She already felt terrible, and she called later in the morning to apologize again. Proverbs tells us that those with good sense are slow to anger, and it is their glory to overlook an offense. If you want to cherish your spouse, you're going to have to learn certain events need to be overlooked. The second thing you have to do to cherish a spouse who stumbles in many ways is to look at the presence behind the problem. There are a couple of podcasts I enjoy listening to. One is political, one is sports related. And I don't think my wife would want to listen to any of them, but because I'm in the house, she overhears it. And one time I just asked her, look, is this bugging you? I don't want to keep doing something that really bugs you. And I'll never forget her response. She goes, of course not, because when I hear those shows, it tells me you're home. And so she's looking at the presence behind the problem. Those shows might bug her. That's the price I pay for Gary being home. I remember watching an interview of the widows following 9/11, that terrible attack on our country. 1 year later, a famous interviewer was talking about 30 or 40 of the widows whose husbands had died in those terrible attacks on the World Trade Center. And I'll never forget what one wife said when the interviewer asked what had changed most about their life. One wife said, I just can't stand it when I hear wives complain about their husbands. And another wife piped up and said, it would make my day. Nothing would make me happier than to walk into the master bathroom and see the toilet seat left up. And what these wives were saying is all of those little things that used to bug them so much now didn't bug them so much because those little things reminded them that their husband was home. And now that their husband wasn't home, now that his presence was no longer there, they would take those little things that used to bug them if that's the price they could pay to have their husbands with them again. A third thing to cherish a spouse who stumbles in many ways is to understand that recovery involves relapse. We don't just change, we don't just become convicted and then everything becomes better. I'll never forget a blogger who wrote a very moving post about how when she got married, she changed positions because she wanted a job that she felt like would more honor her marriage. It wouldn't have so much travel. So they were really tight for money. And then she was a little bit nervous about all the intimate aspects of marriage. So early on, when her husband was getting a little bit frisky and she's worried about money and knew what was about to come, and she just felt all of this anxiety rising up, and she dealt with food issues her entire life. And so she decided she's going to act out on one of her food addictions. And so she told her husband, wait, I just need to use the bathroom very quickly. But she didn't go into the bathroom. She went into the kitchen. She opened up the refrigerator door and she said, I just wanted anything that I could eat. And she's shoving noodles into her mouth. And when she had a little bit of a noodle hanging out of her mouth, she sensed someone behind her. And she turned around and looked, and there was her husband. At first, she felt tremendous shame, but she saw a smile on his face, and it was so healing. He got out a fork and he sat down with her and he said, you don't have to do this alone anymore. We're married. And what could have been a moment of shame became a moment of great healing and a moment of great intimacy when he loved her through that relapse. But it was interesting because this same writer later on in her marriage wrote about how she discovered her husband had fallen again with pornography and how she said she basically punished him for 3 days with icy silence. Now, wives, I get how it feels very different to imagine your husband looking at porn and you dealing with food issues. And I'm not trying to equate the two at all. But it was interesting to me as I read how she felt cherished in the midst of her relapse and how hard it was for her to cherish her husband in the midst of that. And maybe I have that perspective because I've worked with a lot of young men as a pastor now, and I see how they get lured into this challenge and sometimes even this addiction early on in life, before they have the spiritual sophistication to even know what's going on. And before they know it, they have these addicted brains and they want to follow the Lord and they don't want to dishonor their wives. But anxiety raises itself, they feel shame, or they deal with triggers and they relapse. That doesn't ever excuse the relapse. But the same attitude is this: do we want to be a prosecuting attorney when our spouse falls again? Or do we want to be the physician? Not to excuse immoral behavior, but to understand the motivation behind it, to have the empathetic heart that Scripture calls us to have. The fourth thing we need to do if we want to cherish a spouse who stumbles in many ways is to learn to give our spouse the benefit of the doubt. Because they're our spouse, I believe they should get the benefit of the doubt. I think of my friends Brian and Diana. They got married very young, and Diana got pregnant very quickly after they were married. She was 8 months pregnant as they were walking through a mall, just that stage where it's so uncomfortable, but she just wanted to get out. And as they were walking through the mall, a very lithe, very athletic, slim blonde walked right past them. Brian looked at Diana and said, "I forgot how pretty you are when you're not pregnant." Yeah. He really said that. Though Diana cried, she ended up giving Brian the benefit of the doubt. And here's why. Here's what she said. And this is the heart of a wife who has learned to cherish her husband. She said this: Brian's heart had no malice. He actually believed he was giving me a compliment. He was, in fact, completely caught off guard when I began to sob uncontrollably. He had no idea what was wrong. I cherished Brian by knowing his character, which allowed me to recover quickly and laugh about this for years to come. Brian thought he was cherishing me by comparing me to a beautiful girl that reminded him of me 8 months earlier. His words got all mixed up and they came out all wrong. A young bride may not have the capacity to understand the thoughts of a young husband. Everything is so new. But she can cherish him by giving him the benefit of the doubt. Would Brian ever have said something to me like that to be intentionally cruel and hurtful? Not a chance. He was trying to compliment me. It took me a few minutes to realize that, but now this is a fun memory, not a bitter one. What I found, if you want to cherish your spouse when they say something stupid, 2 things can really help. 1, don't have a fantasy conversation with your spouse. When you have a fantasy argument where you're confronting them, you're thinking that what really needs to happen is that they need to hear how much you hurt, when reality is you need to hear their perspective. Maybe they didn't intend to hurt you at all. So hold off on that fantasy conversation. And second, when you begin the conversation, start it with the question. Tell me what you were thinking. What was going through your mind, instead of leading with an accusation. We don't build a cherishing heart by lecturing our spouse or being a prosecuting attorney who's able to convict them with the evidence. We build a cherishing marriage by trying to understand our spouse and see what it is that led to the offense. The 5th and final thing that will help us learn to cherish our spouse who stumbles in many ways is to recognize their royalty. While we can't always honor them for their behavior, we can honor them for their position. Think of it this way. Prince George gets a lot of press and a lot of photos taken of him, even though he hasn't accomplished anything. But as the son of William and Kate, he's filled with royal blood, and so everything he does takes on a new importance. Spiritually speaking, you married a royal spouse. We know this from 1 Peter. Peter writes, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, so that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." Now, this talking about us being a royal priesthood is the context that precedes what Peter says to wives in chapter 3, verse 1, and husbands in 3:7. It's a clear statement that we're to treat each other in light of our spiritual royalty. Our marriages are about more than each other. They're about testifying to God's kingdom, and each family is really ruled by a king and a queen with their children, and we have to recognize that royal place. That's the way we honor each other. Those who read my books know I love to read widely in the Christian classics, and I love to read widely from other Christian traditions. And traditional Eastern Orthodox weddings have a practice that is intriguing to me. They call it crowning. And what they do is they take these 2 crowns and they put one on the husband's head, on the groom's head, and one on the bride's head. And if you look, it's really fun. They're actually connected. Now, in old Eastern Orthodox weddings, they would walk around like this for 8 days with the crowns being connected. Today, it's often just a small part of the ceremony, or they take it off during the reception. But it's making a statement to the couple. You're now adults in the sense that you are going to rule as a king or a queen and with your family. And you're a long order of royal couples descending from Adam and Eve, the first ones who were told to rule over every living thing that moves on the ground in Genesis 1:28, going down through Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel, David and Bathsheba, Zachariah and Elizabeth, to Joseph and Mary. It's a recognition that Christian marriage is about more than happiness and children. It's about testifying to God's long-term plan to bring humanity back from the fall, to reclaim God's word through the Messiah. And here's the key point. A queen might have a bad day, but she's still a queen. So we have to treat her like that. Women, a king can have an awful day, but he's still a king, and you need to treat him like a king. And when we do that, marriage changes. I met a man named Terry in Winnipeg who excelled at loving his wife like royalty. In fact, he literally called his second wife Princess. Terry had 2 marriages. Both wives died of cancer. The first wife had died after a long 5-year battle with ovarian cancer, and then the last 8 months required around-the-clock care. So Terry had to do everything to take care of her. That's just what you do when your spouse has a disease like that. Then he lived as a single man for 4 years, where again, he had to do everything on his own. And so when he married Sharon, he just kept up that same attitude. He served her. He called her Princess, and Sharon just loved it. They had a wonderful 17 years of marriage, and then she died as well. And Terry told me that his second marriage was much richer and in many ways much better than his first marriage, certainly much closer, not because his second wife was more excellent than his first wife, but because his attitude in his second marriage was so much better than his first. Because he had had all those years of having to serve a wife who was so sick and then doing that as a single. And when he brought that attitude into his second marriage and treated his wife as special, so that even when she would stumble in many ways, he still thought of her as a queen. And you still treat a queen like a queen, even when she doesn't always act like a queen. Terry's experience reminds us that it's not about the excellence of our spouse that leads to a cherishing marriage, but it's the excellence of our attitude, that we have a cherishing attitude, that we treat our spouse like royalty. His attitude that if she stumbles, I'm going to catch her. If she has an addiction, I'm going to walk with her through it. That even on a bad day, I'm going to remember she's still a queen, and I want to treat her like a physician, not a prosecuting attorney. That's what gives us a rich and intimate, cherishing marriage.